What's going on, everybody? This is Andy Morales, and welcome to a new edition of Unraveled Influence. This is the first episode of season 8, as we are in the hiatus right now. But of course, like we promised, we will have some pre recorded episodes. And my guest right now is David Gunton. Brother, how are you?
Andy, I'm well. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the invite and for having me on.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So, how are you? Like, how are things with you?
Busy, busy, busy. I have a day job that keeps me pretty well occupied, and three kiddos at home, and a little poetry in there somewhere. So never a dull moment.
Awesome, awesome. Good to know, good to know. Yeah, same here. Just, making the day work. So
Yes,
that's
good.
what that's what it is. So I guess we'll start with this question. So how did poetry begin for you?
Yeah, it's probably not the most unique origin story, but somewhere in there around between high school going into college, I found my way to a copy of On the Road. And, it was like nothing I ever read before and just loved it. And I don't think I was even interested or picked it up because I was interested in writing so much of the time as I was travel. I hadn't traveled a lot at that point in my life, but loved the book. That was a gateway, I think, to the Beat Poets.
Hmm.
Um, really loved that writing and that poetry. And it opened up a whole new world for me about what writing can be like, just the idea of a life as an artist or a life that includes art, as part of your life. And I think that was the start.
Awesome. And I know you mentioned beat poets, and I do think about like Allen Ginsberg as such, for example. What is it about that type of poetry that fascinated you?
I think it was just so different than anything I had been exposed to before, either in school or outside of school. I had a pretty sheltered suburban kind of life growing up as a kid, and no complaints about that. But really hadn't been exposed to a lot that was countercultural, I guess you would say.
Okay.
So, in stumbling upon Howl in America and all this incredible poetry by Ginsberg and Gregory Corso and Gary Snyder. It was just so new, and it set me on a new path. And I found other forms of poetry after that. And honestly, it's not the poetry I so much read or respond to today, but I still love it. And it's definitely how I got started.
Yeah, Allen Ginsberg and those people back in the day, they were very different from that time period. Because I know this was, if I'm not mistaken, I believe this was post-war
Hmm.
time. So it was
Yeah.
interesting because I know that was a time where, like, I believe that was the silent generation, and it
Yeah.
like certain awareness wasn't even a thing. And I know
Yes.
with that time, they were more like, no way, but why are we still living this way? Why are we still doing this? No, shouldn't we explore more different ideas? And I think that's what fascinated about me, the fact that they were, like you said, countercultural. Like they were, it's like they were going against the grain, if that makes sense, to the point.
Totally.
Yeah. And I think that's what fascinated me personally because it was so different. And I think that's what was the bridge to the hippies era on top of that, which really created this whole landscape for what we look back on today. So definitely for sure. I think what I like about poetry too is that poetry could take you to so many directions, and it's like you look back, and even though it feels like it's from outside, but it's really not from outside, it's from within. But you look and be like, wow, I didn't think I could expand my mind that way. So when you talk about your poetry, how is your mindset when you're writing? How's the process look like? What goes through your mind when you're writing a piece?
Yeah. I wish I could say I had a great routine or process,
Hmm.
or I had the discipline to, find that hour or 2 hours or 10 minutes or whatever
Right.
every day, but I don't. I completely fail at that. And, part of that is, hey, life is full and that's great. And I'm not complaining about that, but it is a challenge to find those odd moments, where you can try to tap into that creative juice inside. And so I think it's being responsive to that and being open to that, and trying to find a little balance so you can take your head in that direction. And so I don't know what's going on in that moment, when it feels like, hey, I got an idea for a poem, or I need to take 5 minutes now and write something down. But I guess it starts with some belief in its importance and its power, and having that sort of commitment to it on a gut level, I think, and then being open to the moments.
Ah, awesome, awesome. No, that makes perfect sense. I love that. So what I did want to talk about your book, Notable Moons. I love the design on this as well, and I wanted to ask you, like, how'd you come up with the name? How did the concept art came about? Like, like, how did tell me about this?
No, it's cool. I appreciate it. Yeah, so one of the poems in the collection is called Notable Moons, and I think it was, to me, a sort of like a half joke, because you read from time to time, and it feels like almost every month or so there's something in the newspaper or online about, oh, there's a blue moon tonight, there's a super moon, there's a harvest moon, and it's going to be the last one for 30 years or whatever. But it seems like there's always one of these that are sort of coming up, and so I was just sort of playing a little bit with that kind of jokey concept of a notable moon, but also maybe offering that as sort of a metaphor for poetry or creation. Moon is that's pretty cool. It's a powerful thing, and poems can be too. So I think it sort of started there, and then when the wonderful folks at Quillkeepers Press were kind enough to decide to publish this, we were talking about cover designs, and I love the sort of vintage star chart, astrological chart maps that you see somewhere. And I've got a really close friend who's got a couple of those on his wall, and that was sort of in my head. And so we were talking, like, wouldn't it be cool to have a cover that sort of conjured that image? And that's I think what we're going for there.
Okay. No, that's awesome. I see what you're saying too with the whole the vintage maps. Yes, right. Like I always think about that with the compass. You need like a compass too with that.
Yeah, right.
That's what it
Yeah.
took me back to. But it's interesting, right? Because I think in the same thing with the moons, I think about seasons, right? As summer, fall, winter, and spring, right?
Yes.
But I feel
Yeah.
like life works that way too, right? Because there's the season that you're in. Like say, okay, there's summer, right? So whatever your summer is, eventually goes into a season where it starts to transition into the fall season. So I feel like the transitional period is the part where, you know, we start to really see what's going on and what we're getting ourselves into. So that's the way I see life, and that's the way I think, like, but from what you talked about as well, it's pretty interesting, So I guess
Yeah,
what, yeah.
I love that about seasons. That's something I'm thinking about. I feel like I'm thinking about more and more, and um, thinking about life in terms of seasons as opposed to, as you were saying, just sort of this linear path. And in the past few years or so, I've gotten really into gardening, which is maybe not the most countercultural thing in the world, or maybe it is. I don't know, but never was interested in before, and then all of a sudden, like, really just wanted to do it. Got really into plants and like growing vegetables and stuff. But you get into that and you get really in tune to the seasons in a way that at least I never was before.
Right.
You're like aware what's happening in the garden now, and that's going to pass, and what's going to happen next, and it feels really centering. Yeah, and I mean, I'm not sure how that informs my poetry, or if it does or not. Maybe it does, but I don't know. It's definitely a different way of looking at the world.
It is. No, I was trying to absorb everything you said. I love that what you said about the gardening. So, what made you want to get into gardening? Because that's very pretty interesting, honestly.
Andy, I think I turned 40 one day, and something happened in my brain. And all of a sudden it was like, I want to do this. And like, it really, like, I was not like an outdoorsy person ever. I'm still not exactly, I don't think. Like, I was like an indoors kid, like afraid of like bugs and, the outside and whatever. But all of a sudden it really appealed to me. And then I got really into this whole like gardening for wildlife, gardening for nature, cultivating native plants because that supports the local bees and butterflies. And that's like a whole thing. And I'm just, on the tail end of it. But I love all that. And if you're lucky enough to have a little space where you can do some gardening, I do feel like you've got this responsibility to do it in a way that is going to be good for the earth and for the environment. We humans have done so many horrible things for the earth, and there's so much repair work to do. So just doing a little bit, feels really important and meaningful. And I love that it feels creative, it's physical, um, and it's the one thing I can do that just sort of takes me out of my head, for a
Wow.
while. So it's been good. It's a good thing for me. Yeah.
No, that's awesome with the gardening, yeah. Because something I have a backyard, but like I know I always been interested with the whole planting thing, how that works and stuff like
Hmm.
that. Because we were talking about seasons, we were talking about the moons, we were talking about how you see life, and we was also talking about like the whole gardening thing. And I think when you put it in a life, like metaphorically too, I feel like for example, perfect example, I was talking to a friend of mine about, how sometimes certain things have to change for certain seasons. And I think in that same way with crops, right? Like when you plant, let's say, seeds for like watermelon, sometimes watermelon, like when it hits winter time, I know that's not the season for it. Or I think strawberries is another one too. And I think in that same way, certain crops only are good for that particular season, because when it's out of season, then it's not gonna sell, I guess, if
Yeah,
that makes sense. So I think in that same way, life also works like that as well.
I like that, and you can't force it. Like
Yes.
that combination. Like it's not. It doesn't have to be a big mystery. And somebody, something I read about gardening. Somebody said, you put a plant in the ground, probably going to grow. It's probably going to be okay. But it's got to have the light and the water and the nutrients, and you can't force it. And nature always wins. Nature always
Yeah.
wins,
Yeah.
and that's kind of nice. Like it makes you feel small, or maybe not small, but it gives you sort of a little perspective about your place in the universe, which I think is healthy. I think it's something else I like about it.
Okay. And do you find yourself like having reflective moments while you're gardening, let's say, for example?
I find myself not thinking, and
Oh,
that's
okay.
that's what that's what I like about it. It's one of the few things that I do, at least in my life, where I'm just doing, and it's clearing out some shrub that you don't want it there, or it's digging holes and planting plants, or it's just weeding, which sometimes is tedious and sometimes it's just great because you just feel like you're doing something. And when it's over, you can look back and it's like, yeah, that looks good now. And I don't listen to music. I don't listen to books or anything. I'm just outside and I love it. It's a moment to just be, and that's a good thing for me.
Awesome, awesome. So why don't we hear something from you right now, as far as from your book, Notable Moons?
Yeah, let's do it. How about I don't have any great gardening poems. That would be a good segue. So I'm sorry about that, but
Hey,
that's
it's
okay.
cool.
That's okay. Why don't we start with, or I can read the first poem in the collection. It's called Bed of Reeds.
Sounds
I'll,
good.
I'll read that. Bed of Reeds. You came into this world the same way we all did, on the banks of an enormous freshwater lake. Your father somewhere off in the brush, searching for this herb or that, for the ceremonial burning, deaf to the calls of the midwives, the 7 midwives, announcing that the moment drew near, crowded around your mother, seated on a bed of reeds, eyes fixed on the horizon, on a boat, a rock, a lone cloud.
Wow. Yeah, you gotta talk to me about this. I love that. Like the choice of words for this piece. I love that. Like the part where it says, "Your father somewhere off in the brushes, and then you talked about the seven midwives announcing that the moment drew near. Can you talk to me about that? That is very intriguing lines right there.
I think what I was trying to have a little fun with in the poem is, we all feel like we are individuals. And that's a very Western culture kind of thing, I think, to emphasize the individuality over the group or the community. But in another sense or another level, we've got so much in common, and our stories are so similar, in a way. So I kind of, it's always hard for me to say after the fact what I was sort of thinking or trying to accomplish with a poem. But I think here I was trying to toggle back and forth between those two ideas. Like, oh yeah, you were born that same way everybody was, like in this like screwball way no one's ever heard of before, and
Mm.
just kind of having fun with those two ideas.
No, 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 that makes sense. I love that. I love that. And see, cause I'm trying to think too, right? Cause I think about midwives. Like, it's interesting. The seven midwives. Like, where did that come from? Like, that just came out of your head. That just came out like that, or is that a reference to something?
Not a reference, I think it's good, at least in some poems. Well, some poems, I think you want every line to kind of have a surprise to it. But then some poems, every all the lines are building up into one sort of aha. It's
Got
more like a
you.
structure. Um, this one, I think, was more where I wanted every line to have a bit of a chuckle or a bit of a surprise to it. So seven midwives, that's a lot.
Yeah.
That's probably more than you need. But who knows? Maybe sometimes you got that. I don't know.
Awesome, awesome. No, that's again, that's fascinating to hear all that stuff for sure. I know, from my understanding, I know you have also traveled a lot. You said I remember you talked about that. So my understanding, I know you traveled to Ohio, Virginia, Washington D.C., New York, Georgia. I wanted to ask you the differences between each place that you lived in, right? Because I notice culture is usually different and stuff like that, and maybe vibe is usually different. How did that look like for you when you were traveling from one place to the other?
Yeah, I was born outside Cleveland, Ohio, and when I was 8, my family moved to Richmond, Virginia, and so I was just a kid, but that was definitely a big cultural shift for me. Uh, in part because as an 8-year-old, you just sort of, or I always assumed like, oh, I'll just live here forever because this is where we're from. We're from Ohio. So just to move at all was big, and I think because it was a different culture, Virginia never quite felt like home the way Ohio did. But went to school there, lived in DC for a couple of years. My wife and I were together at that point, and we both just loved New York. Having visited there a couple times, New York City. There wasn't a lot keeping us in Washington, D.C. at that point in our lives. So we moved to the city, first to Brooklyn and then into Manhattan and then back to Brooklyn, and lived in the city for 13 years and just absolutely loved it. Once again, thought, oh, I'll never leave this place. But I don't know. I've always, or at least for a while, I've had this orientation of kind of always looking forward as opposed to looking back, and maybe having some FOMO as well. And so love city life, but then was working kind of stressful jobs, sort of high pressure. That was a lot. And then just started to think, well, maybe I don't know, there's another way to live that's not so stressful, but just as meaningful and enjoyable. We wound up moving to Athens, Georgia. My wife is from Georgia. A lot of her family's still there. So it was appealing to be closer to them, but it was just also appealing to have a very different lifestyle, at least for a while. And Athens is a wonderful, wonderful city, and met so many great friends there, and still have great friends there. Lived there for 5 years and change. Once again, thought, well, this will be where we are. But, I don't know. At that point, we had New York in our blood, missed it. New York still felt like home after living in the city for 13 years. Thought about sort of long term, what's it going to be like for us? What's it going to be like for our kids? and wound up moving back to the New York area not quite 4 years ago. And now we're just outside the city. So, yeah, I have moved around a bit. Not sure where that comes from or why that's sort of shaken out that way, other than sort of I've always been thinking about, well, what else is out there, and could life look differently? And my wife and I together just always sort of betting on ourselves and taking that chance together, even if we didn't have the situation in the next place totally lined up and totally figured out. We've always sort of said to ourselves, well, we'll figure it out because we trust each other and we trust ourselves. So dancing through the raindrops, so far so good. It's all more or less worked out, and here we are. Here we are.
Wow. No, that's amazing. The whole betting on yourself. And that's really what it was for me and my wife as well, actually, because, I've had people tell me, oh, well, you can't think a certain way, or you can't do this, you can't do that. And I like to think that, hey, I think we've proven a lot of people wrong. We've been
Yeah.
together for 7 years, but we've been married for 5, going on 6 now. So it's,
Uh-huh.
the whole betting on ourselves, yeah, because you know what is too, me and my wife look at it, okay, we're going to take a leap of faith, see what
Yeah.
happens, and then see where it goes. And if it's meant, like, if it's allowed, if God allows it, then what, good. Then I guess we're in the right place. If not, then he'll just prevent every obstacle possible, not because he doesn't want us to have certain things. I look at it as like, or like, say, in some places, some people say the universe, if it's meant to be, it'll happen. If it doesn't happen, maybe because it's not meant to be. Not that it's anything bad, but it's just more like, it's just to because you don't know what life is protecting us from, they say,
Yeah.
so
I think it's a special thing what you're describing when you've got a partner who you can take that leap of faith with, and really commit to doing it together. I know I feel really, really lucky that I found someone like that, and it sounds like you're lucky too. So that's great.
yeah, I'm incredibly, and I always say this, like, I feel like my wife's the reason I do the things I do, I
Hmm.
guess. It's interesting because this platform, Unraveled Influence, wasn't always, I went through a lot of rebranding, and I struggled a lot with this platform, this podcast, because I felt like this is something I always wanted to do. This is something I've always felt like I've been called to do, but I just didn't know exactly how to get there. And 2022, I was on a little hiatus, and when 23 came about, I really didn't know where my life was going. And my wife's like, this year alone, I'm expecting you to bring your podcast back.
Uh-huh.
Something tells me that this is gonna be better this time around. I'm like, I guess, I'm like, okay. And it's so interesting. I wish my co-host could have been here, but like she had like a lot of school stuff she had to take care of because she is a teacher, so she had stuff to take care of. Sorry,
Yep.
Angela. Maybe next time. But and it's so interesting. So my platform, right? Okay, so on Instagram, the page has been through a lot. So it was my poetry page again, and I guess from all the stuff the page has been through, I didn't realize that I was following a lot of people, or people were following me. Didn't think anything of it. I saw this one post, and it was from Angela, and that one post actually changed the trajectory of pretty much the rest of this year and my entire life, because it's like, okay, I don't know what it was. It's funny because I had another partner originally, but that didn't work out. And it was like, oh, it's the story of my life again. Somebody, it just wasn't gonna work out. I'm like, okay, I'm done. I had this one episode with Angela, and it was the first episode under the Unraveled Influence name, and she was just a guest. She was just a guest, and there was something about that interview that I was just thinking, you know what? Something kept telling me, hey, reach out to her, reach out to her. I'm like, she don't think I'm a creep. I don't know her like that, but let's see what happens. And it's interesting how this happened back in January. It's now pretty much September, and it's I can't believe it that now here we are. Like, wow, this one post made a gigantic impact, but had my wife not pushed me, hey, restart this podcast, I don't know if I would have met Angela and everybody else I've met afterwards. And it's funny because if there was one person I kind of have to give credit to for always believing in me, I mean, my wife is always number one, right? But there was also somebody else, and that was Stephanie Lamb, who's also the
Yes.
creator of Quillkeepers Press.
Yes. The best. She's the best.
Yes, and I always look at her someone like some sort of like a mentor. Like I always tell her this because I learned so much from her. I've understand the business aspect of life through her. But like whenever I didn't understand something, like she would always give me advice. And but it's the whole like she was one of those, like she's definitely one of my supporters, and I feel like I can't talk about that if I don't talk about my wife or Stephanie Lamb or even my father, because my dad, he's the main reason I started writing poetry in the first place. And when he passed away in 2018, it just became this bigger thing. But I didn't know how craziness this was gonna be. But like I was saying before, I definitely have to give a shout out to Stephanie Lamb because she was definitely one of our supporters of this platform from day one. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate what she does for you guys who's providing that service to publish your words and get your words out there and traditional publishing and stuff like that. So I have to put that out there.
For sure. Yeah, and I think, creative people need those supporters and partners in their life to give them that boost sometimes. I think we think about creative people as, oh, there's these lone individuals and they go into their dark room and they make incredible things and come out and show it with the world. But of course, it doesn't work that way at all. Like everyone's a part of a community, and so many creative projects are actually group projects, in some form, or it's that really important person in your life who maybe it's like a life partner, or maybe it's somebody who just comes in, at some stage like you're describing, and like gives you that boost to get going, and it just changes your perspective on something. So that's cool. And I love to hear a good social media story too about a connection like that. There's so many horrible social media stories. So that's a really good one. So we'll lift that up.
Yes, it is interesting too because I remember like growing up, especially like I've always heard the nightmares of catfish, catfish, and then there's this show that came out on MTV, and it's good to know that even in that community, it's like wow, like how something like what I don't think poetry's dead. I think poetry's been distorted and is reviving itself little by little, especially this year around. I feel like how something like that could bring people together for better or for worse, I guess, lack of a better term. And it's like it brings people together in a sense where okay, we can share our brokenness and be vulnerable together, and I feel like that takes a lot for someone to do that.
Yeah. It's changing. The genre is, it's changing, and that's okay. Like it's not popular like it was, at least in this country, 100 years ago or so. I mean, you read stories about the preeminent poets of their day, like T.S. Eliot, like giving a reading and like literally selling out a stadium somewhere,
Yeah.
or just like everybody had the book, even folks who were not poets themselves or thought of themselves as literary. That's totally changed. That may not ever come back, but mediums have changed. Like there's so many different avenues now for creative people to
Yes.
express themselves, and those options were limited 100 years ago, and now there's so many options, whether we're talking about tech of any sort, any kind, or just different genres
Yeah.
or whatever. And like that's fine, like that's cool. Now it's songwriting, or now it's something on a tech platform or whatever, because it's so much more accessible, and that's great. And so poetry is in a different place than it was before. It'll change again. And I think our job, not my own job, responsibility, role as poets is to kind of roll with that, and not just, it's so easy to be defensive, because you're used to a way something used to be, and think like, oh, that was always the best way. We've got to preserve that forever. No, everything's
Right.
always
Right.
changing.
Yeah.
Everything is always changing. Change with it, and we'll all be stronger.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. I love how you said that. That's wow. That is Wow, I love how you said that. I really love how you said that, and it's true. I feel like some things become something, but everything has to change eventually. And I like to think it would like to change for the better, you know. And it's true what you said. No one, you don't see a lot of stadium places where people read poetry anymore.
No.
Even though like my main go, like one thing I said about this platform. I mean, I want to expand outside of just social media, which I have announced that, you know, on October 20th, we're going to have our first person in person open mic in Bayonne, New Jersey.
Fantastic.
Yeah, everyone's invited. You know, place is free. Just reserve a spot, and you know we'll make it work. But it's the whole thing about it is in Bayonne, I was doing research with my wife, and my wife's been again a big part of what I'm doing with Unraveled Influence is that she, you know, she did research. She said, "Hey, let's see if there's any open mics available in Bayonne," and it looks like there's none, but it seems to be a very high demand. And I
Hmm.
always wonder why there isn't no art in Bayonne, which is so weird because Bayonne is a very interesting part of Jersey. There's this saying, if it's in Bayonne, leave it alone. Like, I never really understood that, but I'm like, okay, sure. I mean, I like the area. You know, every place you go to, there's always a place that's not that cool. That's just how it is. But
Sounds like a good place for art to happen. I don't know Bayonne very well, to be
yeah,
honest, but if people are putting it down, then it sounds like that's the place for
exactly.
artists to lift it up. So
So yeah,
sounds like you're in the right place.
so myself and Angela are capitalizing. I told my wife, I said, babe, I gotta capitalize on this. I'd be stupid if I did not jump on this. Went to this bar called Shorty's. They do karaoke, they have pool leagues and stuff like that. I said, hey, how do you guys feel about an open mic? And I kind of gave them a breakdown of what we do, and they were like, "Let's do it." And I like, and it goes back to what you said about betting on ourselves. I'm like, okay, I don't know what's gonna happen, but I'm gonna bet on myself. I'm gonna bet on this thing, and we're gonna do it. Let's see how it happens, and hopefully, if it goes good, we could do more of these. But this is the beginning, so it's one of those. Back to what we talked about earlier about seasons, how we're in that season that okay, we're kind of getting out of not getting out of, let me say that, we're transitioning into an outside aspect of poetry, and I don't know, I like to be hopeful and think that maybe one day we could have some kind of poetry revival of some sort, but which leads to the question, because I've asked this question a lot. I've had episodes about this question, and the question is, do you think poetry's dead? Do you think it's dying? Or do you think it's distorted? Why not? There's no wrong or right answer here.
I don't think it's dying at all. I think poetry will always find its place, in part because it is so accessible, and it's so weird. It's kind of like, what is it? It's not a story. It's not visual. It's just this sort of magic, for lack of a better word, combination of words that create this thing, and it doesn't quite fit into any other sort of genre category, and it speaks to people. And there's this, there's magic to it. I think novelists and or poets, they're sort of the closest thing we have to true magicians today because they conjure these worlds just by
Mm,
speaking words, like casting a spell almost.
okay.
And it's, I don't know, it's transfixing. It takes people places. And I think poetry kind of fills some vacuums, in our society and our creative society, and always there's always people who respond to it. So it's not filling stadiums right now, and your neighbor may not pull out his or her, you know, dog-eared copy of The Wastelander, Leaves of Grass or something, but it finds its home, and I have no doubt that it will persist.
I agree. Wow. I love that. That's very well put. I have to say, it's interesting too because back in the day too, you would see Allen Ginsberg on like the Letterman show or something like that. Like
Yeah,
you
right.
would see people like that. Now you don't really see
Yeah,
much in
he'd be
those
like on the
things.
William Buckley, like Crossfire, like political debates, and I think there is something lost there. I don't know, and now maybe I'm being defensive about the old ways, but
Hey, nothing wrong with that.
yeah, I do. I wonder if we've sort of lost something with artists being more part of that cultural, political, social conversation in a way a generation or two ago, whereas now everything is a little more niche, a little more siloed. You know, the artists are doing this thing, the politicians are doing this thing. I could probably argue that both ways, but yeah, I do think about Allen Ginsberg being on, network talk shows
Mm.
50 years ago, and I'm trying to think what is um, the corollary to that now. I guess a generation ago, Maya Angelou had that status and that standing.
Yeah.
I think about, Amanda Gorman definitely became part of the cultural conversation in an awesome way, I think, after her inaugural poem. So, yeah, thinking further, maybe there is some of that today. But yeah, it's cool when you can bring different people together for those kinds of conversations because I think it goes different places.
Yeah, I definitely agree. When it comes to poetry, I think I don't think it's dying. I don't think it's dead. I don't even think it's lost. I think it's just I wouldn't say it's distorted. Rather, I think the direction it's I don't want to say it's misleading. It's more like the direction is not where maybe this is my opinion, but I don't think it's where it needs to be. I guess it's in a it's not in a bad place, but it's not a good place either. But it's not. I think it's in an okay place because social media, I feel like definitely made a difference with that. Because before Instagram, there was Tumblr. That's where poetry started to get kind of a boost a little bit back in 2011, 2012, but then for whatever reason it kind of okay though, that was it. And then Instagram came, and I think once the lives started to happen and people started posting stuff, I think that's when it got very interesting. So I'm going to say poetry is interesting in this season of this life, I guess, because
Yeah. I'm sorry, Andy, I was going to ask you something. Do you think poetry is more a performance art today than it was in generations past?
Wow, that's good. That's actually pretty good. Wow. That's a very good question. I think it's a little bit of both, only because I know I see these platforms like Voices in Power, and then there's another one called the New York Cafe. They do stuff, Bowery Poetry, like there's those places that like they do events like mostly New York, or like Voices of Power more like they go to London and stuff like that too. So they're a little bit more bigger than us, obviously. But um, I notice when you say poetry is very interesting now with the word itself, because if you see someone that does poetry but doesn't have a piece of paper on them, they don't, cause they consider that more a spoken word rather than a poem. They'll say, "Oh, this is a piece I'm gonna read," but it's a spoken word piece. It's not a poetry piece. Like that's something I've noticed about social media and that Instagram community that I've been in since 2018. When you say poetry, it's not a generalized thing, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think there was a time when like memorizing poems was pretty common, even part of like grade school. And then you
Yeah.
think way, way back, Homer didn't have a piece of paper. It was it was all
Right.
oral history and oral tradition, but certainly poetry, epic poetry. Um, and now today, like if you ask me to recite a poem, I'm not sure I could think of one that I really memorized other than some Robert Frost from like the sixth grade or something that's still stuck with me
Mm.
over all these years.
Okay.
So it's odd to think if someone's performing spoken word somebody might look at that and say, well, that's not poetry because where's the writing or where's it written down? But yeah, for centuries there was this oral tradition of poetry, which again, like I'm not practicing right now. And yeah, it's interesting to think about how that's sort of ebbed and flowed or changed.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely, and yeah, that's very interesting, like you said too, because I feel like with poetry or spoken word, it's like I think about it with music, right? Because there's pop music, but then there's country pop, then there's alternative rock, pop rock, like this all this stuff, and I'm just like, they sound kind of similar, but they're not. If that makes sense, they're not the same, but they're similar, and I feel like it's interesting because when I was I don't want to say when I was growing up, but rather when I was maybe like in high school going to college, I was told that memorizing poems makes the pieces more authentic rather than just reading it from a paper, because people
Hmm.
don't get the actual emotion, in opposed to when you're um see, because if you're memorizing a piece, but then they say, oh well, reciting poetry and then memorizing a poem are two different things. Then there's that aspect. I remember back in college there was like a debate thing about that. But like, oh no, you're not a real spoken word artist if you have to read from a paper. Like there's that. But then, oh, if you recited a piece from a paper, then you're not really a poet. Like there was this whole thing. So
Hmm.
I find it
Always be
very
skeptical of
interesting.
those purity tests, I think.
Wait, say that again. Or what?
Always try to be skeptical of those kinds of purity tests. Like you got to
Yeah.
do it this way, you got to do it that way. It's funny that you mentioned the Nuyorican. I read there once, many, many, many years ago, when I was a lot younger. And what I remember, it was an awesome, awesome experience. And I remember I read a poem. I did have a piece of paper in my hand. I was reading it. I had not memorized it. And this was like the late 90s.
Mm.
And it was a poem about Joe Camel, which was that
Mm.
cartoon, spokesperson for Camel cigarettes.
Wow.
And I think they had just, decided they had to get rid of that logo or whatever, because obviously it was just marketing towards young people and terrible, and everything about the tobacco industry is terrible. We
Mm.
all know that now. But it was this, like, I think it was even called Elegy for Joe Camel. It must have been just the world's worst poem ever. But the people at the Nuyorican were so incredibly welcoming and so supportive, and that was a once in a lifetime wonderful experience.
Wow. I know recently I found out I think they're gonna go for renovation for 3 years actually. I don't
Yeah,
know
I was just
when.
Googling it while we were talking, and if there's a big renovation project. So hey, everybody pitch in and help the Nuyorican.
Yeah.
Renby, that's a special place. Let's all
Yeah.
do our part.
Word. No, but that's always been a special place in my heart too, because I've said this to Angela as well. I've said this to many people. I feel like out of all, I mean, I definitely want to start doing open mics, like to perform in an open mic. See, that's what I'm saying. Am I gonna read a? Am I reading or am I performing? So that's a very interesting thing too. But either way, like I don't mind going to different places to start doing that, because that's why I figure, hey, I could start with my thing on October 20th. But then now I know people within the community, they have their own platforms, they do their open mics, so virtually it's been great. But now it's like, okay, can I go out there and do that? But my bucket list has always been the Nuyorican Cafe. At least before I die, I feel like I have to go there at
Got to
least
do it. Got to
once.
do it. And the other thing I remember about that night, I read with a couple of friends, and one of my friends was a much more formal and frankly a lot better poet, with like really intricate stanzas and rhymes and imagery, and like he's just a fantastic poet. And so he read. I think he made it to like the finals because it was like a competition, and like he was one of the finalists. And so a couple of the other finalists were, more performative, dramatic, incredible stage presence. And my friend, less stage presence, but like a beautiful and very formal, poem. and he read, and I remember somebody called out, "Don't pick the poet, like don't pick this guy, like as the winner," which was like joke, and everybody laughed, But there was that like tension in the room between like this guy doing this more sort of like conventional traditional poetry thing versus the folks doing more of a what you might call spoken word kind of thing. But all of the above is poetry, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and there's this argument. Well, not yeah. I guess you could say like an argument, or there's this idea, I guess, that poetry comes in different shapes and forms. I definitely agree with that. I think it comes a lot in music. So like, I think we've kind of answered the question too. Even in music, there's poetry in it, you know. So I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, because we I noticed we were talking a lot about structural formats and stuff like that when it comes to poetry, and I feel like, like you said, oh, like there's this standard we have to write a certain way, or structure it a certain way, and I noticed Allen Ginsberg was the exact opposite of a lot of his pieces was comma 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 commas, but he was
Yeah.
telling a story. And because I was always told in high school, oh well, when you write poetry, it has to be a stanza, stanza, stanza. And for a long time I would write like that, but then there's been times where I'm like, I don't want to write like that. But then I wouldn't release a piece, or I wouldn't present the piece unless it was structured in a stanza. But then I feel like if it has to be in a stanza, I feel like you're limiting yourself to an idea of expansion when it
Yeah.
comes to what your thoughts might be. So I just wanted your opinion on that, honestly.
I think it all works. I've never had a lot of success or felt like I've written anything I felt great about that rhymed or was in pentameter. I used to take a shot at villanelles and sestinas, and it's fun to experiment with that. Can't say I wrote a lot of those that I felt really proud of. Um, for me, I do I do like to pay attention to the line and take the line breaks very seriously. And I'm always thinking
Mm.
about breaths and how would I read it, and I try not to ever break the line just any old place, but thinking about if I'm reading it, where am I breathing? Is the pause meaningful for the poem? And so that is a structure that's important for me. Sometimes I write in stanzas. They're all 4-line stanzas. Sometimes I don't. Um, I think there's a tension there. In a weird way, that structure can be um, empowering sometimes because you sort of adopt these restrictions, and you've got to do 4 lines in this stanza, or you've got to do 10 beats or whatever, and that restriction can force you to a new place that you would not have gone to otherwise. And
Mm.
sometimes that's cool. And sometimes it's the heck with all that. That is limiting me. And I'm just going to write on the page, however feels right. I also like to write prose poems. There's not any in the Notable Moons book, but I love, certain prose poets. And like, what is that? Like, is it a poem? Is it a story? They're often surreal or just uncategorizable. And that it feels very, very like liberating, to use that format. So I don't know. I think there's pros and cons, uh, whatever way you attack that.
Yeah, amen, amen to that. So why don't we hear another piece from your book right now?
All right, let's do it. Um, I read the first poem in the collection. Now I'll read the last one, just for fun. It's called "The Mountain." You decided to leave everything behind for a bit and hike the mountain, and so did everyone else. You were shoulder to shoulder on the trail, your view blocked by a man with a child in his backpack. You stopped at a stop where they were selling t shirts, canteens, and playing cards depicting the mountain. You bought a t shirt and a coffee and sat down next to a fellow hiker. We live in primitive times, he said, and he had that faraway look in his eyes.
Wow, I love that. Talk to me about this piece. That's awesome. I love the wording with that one.
Yeah, it's funny. We were chatting for a minute the other day, and we were talking about how sometimes the poem is smarter than the poet, and I always think that's true. the poem's going someplace that the poet may not even realize or intend. But you know what I think I was up to here, if I was up to anything, is that experience I think we've all had. You try to like manufacture some like really special experience, like, oh, I'm going to go on this hike today, and there's going to be this beautiful view, and it's going to be just me and nature. And then you go there, and it's just like throngs of people, and it's the most commercial and lame experience you could you could possibly imagine. But somewhere in there, you find a little moment of something special or a little moment of serenity. So I think that's what was going on there, if anything.
No, that's awesome, and it's funny because when you were reading, because I have the physical book myself, so I was reading along with what you were reading, and I felt like I envisioned myself as the person climbing the mountain, and then I
No
see
good.
people with the canteens, like, okay, why are they up here? Like, that's
Yeah.
see, the thought that was coming to my
Why are
mind
all these
was,
people here? Yeah.
I'm like, we're supposed to be just hiking and climbing. We're enjoying. Like, why are you in this one? Cause you know what's funny? Cause I'm thinking a situation like it's in a weird spot, and I'm like, why are you doing it there when you
Yeah.
should be doing it at better ground level? What the hell is going on here?
Yeah. One of my
uh,
favorite poets of all time was Charles Simic, and he was awesome. And he just passed away in the past year, and got to meet him a couple times. Great guy. Wrote a lot of prose poems, also surrealist lyrical poems. And I feel like a subtext of a lot of his poems was, we are all idiots at the end of the day. We all think we're so special and doing special things. And we're one of a kind and we're individuals, but guess what? We all have our moments where we look ridiculous. Not that that's like the final word in anybody, but just sort of like a counterpoint to, you know, our sort of base state of thinking a lot of ourselves. And I think that's often the joke, in his poems. And I love that. And I always think it's so funny and probably aspire to do stuff like that myself sometimes in my own writing.
Right. No, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, no, awesome, awesome. And I wanted to ask you because I know that's not the only book you have. You have another book called maybe I might pronounce this wrong. It's called Poegles. Is that what that's called?
Poegles, Poegles, a book that was I wrote with my very best friend and writing partner, Justin Hendricks, and Justin really gets the credit for the idea behind Poegles. This was in the I don't know if it was the early days of the internet, but the earlier days of the internet. And
Mm.
Justin started playing around with, just putting a phrase in Google and seeing what the search results were, and then taking all those search results and cobbling together or cutting up, and reassembling into a poem, and very much thinking. We talked about beat poets earlier, thinking about William Burroughs' cut up poems, where he would literally take like the newspaper and put it on the piece of, like on a table and cut up with like an X-Acto knife lines and sentences and words and then rearrange them to create this sort of found poem, or he called them a cut up poem. And that's what
Mm.
Justin was up to in creating these Poegles, which was just poem plus Google together. We sort of made this word. And we each wrote a bunch and put them together in that collection. And it's funny now, I look at it and I can't even remember which ones, for some of them I wrote and which ones Justin wrote. And I think we probably edited them together. But
Mm.
it was a really fun and interesting way to approach, you know, poetry, but also interact like what was going on with, Google and just this new world of, all information, all of human history being at your fingertips, and being able to access that and turn it into a work of art.
That seems like intense work too. Like Google, like whoever created this, and
That was
it's
fun. It
like,
was fun. It was fun. And fortunately, Google hasn't found out about it, and they haven't sued us yet. So that's good. So it's been a good run so far. But it's all done with a great affection and love for the Google platform. So I'm sure if they wanted to reach out or perhaps promote the book, we could work something out.
eh, right? Why not? Hey,
Why not
possibilities are
get paid?
endless.
get paid.
Right. One day we'll all get paid for this. Yes. Oh man, that's no, that's cool though, man. Like, they talk to me about the collaboration aspect because I know it's okay. Like, I always hear the horror stories of creative minds getting together, and sometimes if you don't agree on something, there's like this whole thing. In your experience, how was that? I guess, like you said, I know you said that was your best friend, so maybe that's not what the case was for you. But what was that like, collaborating, sitting down with Justin, and saying, "Hey, let's do, like, what, like, who came up with the idea in the first place, and then what made you guys decide, okay, let's get this done." What was that like for you guys?
It was all Justin's idea, and I was just, drafting behind his genius with the Poegles project. But Justin is my best friend. He's a writing partner as well. We still write together, and I don't remember a lot of like sitting down together and hashing it out. But it was a time when we were already leading busy lives, and so I think probably a lot of what we wrote, we were writing online and just trading, emails or whatever platform we were using at the time. And it was like a way to connect. Like it was a way to be creative and to write together, but also, a way to do something together with, one of the most important people in my life. So it was a wonderful project, and we still write together. And in fact, I owe a lot of notable moons to Justin because, I go through periods in my life where work is busy and family's busy and everything's busy and I'm not writing a lot. And then Justin will reach out and say, "Hey, let's write a poem a day for the next week,
Oh
or the
wow.
next 2 weeks. Like, let's just do it. And here's a topic, and it could be some random thing." And we were doing that when I was writing a lot of what wound up in Notable Moons. And we talked earlier in the conversation about having those people in your life, who will support you and give you that kick, that boost, when you're trying to work on something creative. And my wife has been that person for me, and Justin's been another person for me. And it's and the other thing about that, which I think is really cool, is when you're writing for one other person, like at least immediately before it goes out to the broader world, like you really want to impress them. You want to show them like,
Mm,
"Hey, look what I got. See if you can do better than this." And
wow.
there's sort of good-natured one-upsmanship about it,
Mm.
which I think if the relationship is strong, it can be a really healthy and really good thing. So that's a fun part of the process too, I think, for both of us.
No doubt, no doubt. And that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all that. That is, wow. Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. So, we are pretty much almost towards the end. I always ask everybody this. So, if in all right, hold on, I'm sorry, I kind of blanked out for a second.
You good?
No,
You good?
so when you pass on, we're all not here anymore. What legacy or what impact do you hope to leave behind? That
Oh
when
gosh, Andy, that's deep. I didn't know you were going there.
no,
Wow.
and what would, like, when people say Dave Gunton, what's the one thing that you want people to remember you by?
Whew. Yikes.
Yeah, I do this to
Um,
everybody. I know that I always throw them off. Hey, but that's a good way to end conversations, but that's perfect.
yeah, the ending with a capital E, the big ending. Uh, um, I hope, not for everybody, but for my family who think about me after I pass away, I hope they think, well, he was a good dad, and he was a good husband, and or tried his best to be. And then if other people ever think about me, gosh, I just hope they think he was a good guy and not a jerk. And I'm not sure I'm going to bat 1,000 on that, but hopefully, wind up with a good percentage. Uh, but thinking specifically about poetry, I don't think I've got an aspiration for folks to think, "Well, that guy was an awesome poet. He was one of the best." But I hope folks who know me think, well, he was a guy who took poetry seriously and took art seriously and really tried to make that part of his life. And if anybody thinks that, then great. That would be awesome.
Wow. No, I love that. That is awesome, and that's perfect. So Dave, thank you so much for doing this with me. Thank you for saying yes to this episode. And
Well, thank you, Andy. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for you for doing this for the platform. Hey, October 20th, Bayonne, right? October 20th? I got it
yes,
right? Open
yes,
mic, October
yes,
20th, Bayonne, New Jersey. That's where it's going
yes.
on.
Dave, thank you so much. Enjoy the
Thanks,
rest of
Andy.
your
It's
night, and
you too. It's been a pleasure.
no doubt.